Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation as part of the 2020 conference for the Association of Recovery Schools, Association of Recovery in Higher Education and the Association of Alternative Peer Groups. My name's Olivia Pinelli and I'll be your host today. We're joined by Sazha, Ramos, Amy Pavlic and Dunn. The topic of today's presentation is recovery housing, campus and community solutions. Just a few reminders and logistics before we turn things over to our presenters. Today's presentation will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube under a password protection for all conference attendees and presenters. You'll be able to go back and access all the information if you've registered for the conference or you're a presenter. We ask that nobody shares this information with people who are not registered without ARHE's prior consent. Conference sessions are approved by a number of continuing education providers. Check out our website for more information, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to email conference@collegiaterecovery.org. So thanks for joining us today. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks everybody for being here. It's the afternoon for us, but if it's another time zone, good morning, evening, late evening, midnight. This is Recovery Housing, Campus, and Community Solutions, and we're just going to dive right into it. My name is Sazha Ramos, and I am the manager of recovery housing at Safe Project. And I have owned and operated 2 recovery homes and lived in collegiate recovery homes and all things recovery housing. I'm really excited to be here because I'm very passionate about housing, how it's helped me in my recovery. And I want to pass it off to my colleague, Amy.
Hey, thanks, Sazha. My name's Amy Pavlic, and I am finishing up my job as the Assistant Collegiate Recovery Program Coordinator at UNC Greensboro, and I'm also a ambassador for the North Carolina Underage Drinking Prevention Campaign. And I also lived in an Oxford house in early recovery and had a really nice experience in trying to open a collegiate Oxford house for UNC Greensboro. And I'll pass it off to Dylan.
My name is Dunn. My pronouns are he, him, his. I serve currently as a technical assistance manager for Safe Campuses, a subset of Safe Project. I have helped start a collegiate recovery community and a collegiate recovery program, as well as worked in a residence life at universities for about 5 years. Luckily now I get to do full-time technical assistance work, but those are my experiences so far.
So my colleagues, both very humble, but they are 2 amazing people that I am so happy to present on this with you guys. So thanks to you both. So our objectives for this presentation are to review a nationwide snapshot of recovery housing. We are going to analyze collegiate recovery housing approaches and opportunities by Dylan, and then learn from personal lived experiences, me and Amy's lived experiences and others as well. So recovery housing nationwide. What is a recovery house? This is SAMHSA's definition of recovery housing, and many people can easily interchange recovery houses with a halfway house, with a 3/4 house, with an Oxford house. But SAMHSA's definition, which is the definition we're using for the presentations, are recovery houses are safe, healthy, family-like, substance-free living environments that support individuals in recovery from addiction. While recovery residents vary widely in structure, all are centered on peer support and a connection to services that promote long-term recovery. Recovery housing benefits individuals in recovery by reinforcing a substance-free lifestyle and providing direct connections to other peers in recovery, mutual support groups, and recovery support services. So what's the history of recovery housing? Recovery housing is often the treatment recovery support service that is overlooked. Everybody talks about detox and treatment, but when we look at recovery as a long-term process, as a long-term self-directed process, recovery housing can be the intervention or support service as soon as a few days into recovery, as far as into years of recovery. The community has moved towards a longer continuum of care, and that's what you kind of see here. We see the acute care, the recovery phase, and the long-term recovery independent living. And all of the different models of recovery houses that we talk about later in the presentation, they support this. So whether you're, again, in early recovery or later in recovery, sober living homes and recovery houses were adopted as an option in the continuum of care model for those in the recovery phase after acute care and transitioning to long-term recovery. So what's the current housing status? Currently, there is no comprehensive data regarding the number of recovery homes in the United States, and this is from a 2018 Government Accountability Report, the GAO report. NAR has about 2,000 recovery homes, and Oxford has about 25 recovery homes throughout the nation. And right now, Dylan might be able to tell us this, but I also don't know what the amount of collegiate recovery housing is as well. This is one of the challenges of recovery housing that I'll discuss later on, because if we can't find them, how do we get to them? So recovery housing classifications. These are a brief overview of recovery housing classifications. Oxford House is a peer-run model steeped in 12-step tradition. They've been around for about 40 years, and they use a state charter system through certain states that have federal funding for Oxford houses. Amy is going to talk a little bit more about Oxford houses, but they are an amazing supporters of the Recovery Housing Collective, and it's been a pleasure to work with them. NAR stands for the National Association of Recovery Residences. There are about 28 NAR states. So NAR has put out a set of standards, and the set of standards go from level 1, 2, 3, and 4 on how the services are provided at these homes. So level 1 would be considered an Oxford house and a peer-run home. 2 would be have a house manager and some more things, and 3 would start having some clinical services. And some might say this is already treatment and not a recovery house, but it's really up to the individual on what they're looking for. And then we have independent sober living owners. Independent sober living owners are separate from NAR and Oxford houses because they might not follow NAR standards and they might not follow Oxford's rules. They might have their own set of rules or lived experiences that they utilize in this home. And that's also one of the challenges with recovery housing. There's no set standards, even though NAR has provided those. A lot of states are voluntary, and recovery housing is so underfunded and not held accountable in this space for recovery houses that anyone could actually open up a recovery house if they wanted to, depending on what state you're in. So some of the challenges and barriers which we've kind of started to discuss is the fraud of recovery houses. Like treatment centers, there's fraud in recovery homes. And there's important questions to ask when looking for a recovery house. The issues of standards. Even though NARP has put out standards, the United States in a whole has not adopted these standards. SAMHSA administration has not named NAR as a best practice as well. There is not enough awareness about recovery houses. They can be different to find. There's a lot of different models that we discuss that also make it difficult to find. There's the exclusion of children. A lot of women need recovery houses for women. Oxford House provides women and children, and some do, but they're very, very challenging to find. They're also very challenging to find for populations like LGBTQIA. They're limited for collegiate recovery housing. They're limited for veterans. And if you don't know someone already in the space, it's really, really challenging to navigate, especially during a crisis. There have been more initiatives throughout the nation for MAT houses, but they are also very far and few between. And then the issue of accountability. This is also a challenge in many states because there's no funding to hold recovery houses accountable. Some states have the Department of Mental Health, where recovery housing lies, and some states also have NAR, or some states have different nonprofits, sober living associations, where you can sign up and be a part of their association. So some of the successes of recovery houses, which we'll go into with Amy's presentation, but just briefly, this is from the National Council study. Some of the research outcomes associated with recovery housing are decreased substance use, reduced probability of relapse and recurrence, lower rates of incarceration, higher income, increased employment, and improved family functioning. And for me, from a lived experience, without my recovery house, I don't think that I would have been able to stay sober, especially as a young person. I think it is vital to recovery. I believe that recovery is housing for many, but we will get into that later in the presentation when we talk some more about lived experience. I am going to pass the ball to my colleague, Dylan. Why don't you take us into recovery housing support in higher ed?
Yeah, so for the next 15 or so minutes, I'm gonna my hope is to broaden the way that we think about recovery housing in higher education, knowing that some students are already getting very creative about how they're making these spaces happen, whether or not they have university support. So as we move forward through my slides, kind of think of recovery housing more as living in a recovery supportive environment, similar to the SAMHSA definition. And yeah, hang on, because I have a lot of content to cram into a little bit of time. So the first thing I want to talk about is a little bit of what Sazha mentioned before regarding like the numbers that we know about recovery housing, particularly on college campuses. Is the numbers aren't great and they're not really well available, or the research isn't super well available. The numbers on the slide, these are the responses from a 2017 Transforming Youth in Recovery census survey that indicates of the about almost 200 collegiate recovery programs at the time, what the breakdown of the services that those programs offered then. At that time, about 60% of the respondents of the survey indicated that they had a collegiate recovery community. About a little less than 40 indicated having a proper collegiate recovery program. And then we're gonna get a little higher than 100% because you can mark more than one service on your campus. But about 30% had some sort of a recovery support referral system. And then to get to the meat of what we're talking about today, only 11% of those about 170 to 200 programs so that they had a recovery residence program. So that's any sort of housing offering for their students in recovery on that campus. And then even lower numbers, less than 1% of programs had transitional living or recovery housing education programs, and then similar numbers with young adult IOPs and then treatment and education programs. And so to get a little haphazard with some numbers and to extrapolate a little bit, in 2017, that meant that only less than 20 universities around the country were willing to say that their university offered any sort of housing for their students in recovery. Is there likely that more universities have students who have access to college-aged housing support? Sure. But this is more of a look at what universities are willing to or able to claim as a true service for their students. So kind of underlines what Sazha had said earlier. And then in my role as a technical assistance person, I help people kind of ask the right questions before they, or as they're pursuing change or pursuing projects on their campuses. And so typically when folks are looking at collegiate recovery housing, there are a couple really foundational questions that we encourage people to ask that may kind of help you decide of whether or not recovery housing in partnership with your university is really even possible at the moment, or how it's possible. I'm sure Amy's story gets really well into that. The first one is funding. If you're going to start a house, who is paying up front for the house or who is paying up front for the space? And then how sustainable is your funding, depending on where that funding is coming from? Especially if you're partnering with a university, are they willing to pay up front, whether or not they know that students are going to be moving in on day one? Are you having grant funding so that can you actually guarantee these students have this resource for their 4 to 6 years if they're just going to undergrad? So kind of framing it around that. And then similarly, can you actually demonstrate the need to your campus right now? Have you reached a critical mass that you can compel a university to act on the need for recovery housing? Knowing that recovery houses aren't going to house 80 people at a time, right? They're not going to be a full-size residence hall to get a university to say, oh, we're going to invest a bunch of money into this. But can you bring together a really sustained and a group of students that can say, we are going to use this if you offer it? A university may be more willing to act if the situation is right. And then scope. is a conversation we're going to have, I'm sure, throughout. First, of how large of a space or program do you need? How many students do you have available that want to do this on day one? And what are the boundaries around your space and what you can and cannot offer? Who will or will not be served? Are you only able to offer a men's house or a women's house? Is your university even going to allow you to do anything outside of binary housing? There's a lot of kind of red tape to dig in there, but being really honest and really critical and thoughtful about those questions before you get started, to set the stage for what you actually can do and be successful in is really important. And then with readiness, as I was saying, are you approaching this in a way that your university or your students can be receptive to truly? Or are you possibly bringing students into, or you creating a space that the university can't support it, isn't ready for it, and so maybe you should actually look off campus for recovery housing, and do it in a way that maybe is more safe for your students, or your university isn't the barrier. You can kind of completely bypass the university as a barrier in the first place. And then again, with my kind of framework being more on campus housing, on or near campus housing, I want to talk about 4 of the approaches that I've seen, and I've seen folks get creative with offering to their students or having their students create themselves around how folks can find recovery supportive housing. The first one is self-created spaces. We'll talk about this, but your students are likely already creating recovery supportive spaces for themselves, whether administrators or universities want to acknowledge it or not. They could still be in denial that they even have students in recovery, but students in recovery are likely creating spaces for themselves. So that can mean ways to support self-created spaces, and we'll talk about are, for example, using the roommate pairing systems that your university likely already has, to pair incoming, more traditionally aged students into on-campus housing, or also facilitating as a staff member off-campus roommate pairing. So if you're a staff member and you know of a collegiate recovery student who maybe has a roommate spot coming up, are you able to pair incoming collegiate recovery students with that person based on need? Theme communities we'll get into, closed communities, so recovery specific housing, a little bit more structured there, and then off-campus non-university resources, which we'll definitely get into. So the first thing I want to talk about, just based on my experience in residence life, is seeing students really utilize the roommate pairing systems that a lot of campuses have, especially if you have an 18, 19, 20-year-old student looking to live in a residence hall. Typically universities with on-campus housing will have, again, that software that allows folks to answer behavioral questions and questions about how they prefer to live their life. And so if you have software that is able to then include recovery framed questions or recovery and abstinence based questions in those software, then students can help find each other, and they can create smaller recovery housing experiences really by having maybe 2 or 3 roommates in the same room in a traditional residence hall. The pro of this is that, of course, these students can ensure they have similar or shared values around recovery, how they define recovery, if that includes abstinence. And they can also create a very defined boundary around what their recovery supportive home base looks like. Because maybe like at the end of this list, it says they can get kind of the most quote unquote typical experience if students are seeking that out of treatment. Not all students do that, but some students want to attempt to experience the more typical college experience. And so if you can have students experience the comfort of having a single room on campus that they know will be safe for them, that they know if they're feeling stressed or they've experienced a trigger, they can go back to that space and be absolutely safe. Maybe that's actually all they're wanting. And then they can navigate the rest of their campus with support from professional staff, peers, but they get to control the scope of that. The cons of this, of course, is that especially young students in early recovery, a traditional residence hall experience really isn't the most recovery friendly or even abstinence supportive space, even though most students in traditional residence halls are underage. Of course, we all know, we've all heard the stories of substance use in residence halls, but particularly if a student is early in their recovery, it can be really difficult to navigate a student being with you in the elevator carrying drugs or alcohol with them, or smelling of drugs and alcohol after a night out. And then additionally, if it's a very small kind of secretive space for recovery, if a student is prone to isolating during a recurrence of use or when they're stressed out, this can kind of feed into that destructive behavior. And additionally, this may require some significant self-advocacy to inform staff and students around the community to try to make the community more recovery supportive. All right, hang in there with me. So the next one, also a bit of my professional experience, is a university was really only willing to meet us like quarter of the way when it came to actually supporting students in recovery and residence life. And that was through creating a broad sense of our substance-free residence hall floor. A lot of universities have these, whether it's a sober floor or substance-free housing, kind of whatever framework, whatever words they use. The pros of this kind of experience is that typically if a student in recovery isn't super jazzed about being wide open about their recovery identity, this allows them to be surrounded by possible allies that give them the freedom to navigate their own recovery identity, disclose when they'd like to, not disclose when they'd like to, but at least feel a little bit more safety around being substance free, being abstinent if that's the recovery pathway, or at least being around folks who value community without substances. And again, this can be a little bit closer to towing the line of a traditional residence life experience for students who seek that out, but still the cons exist of traditional residence halls are not really great suited for folks in early recovery. A really important con of substance-free housing or substance-free residence hall floors is they can be a bit of a gamble because it's not always students who self-select to be on those floors. Sometimes it's parents who select for their students that I want my student to be substance-free or I want my student to follow my values, so therefore I will put them on this floor before they even know what I'm doing. And so then those students arrive on the floor and they're like, wait a minute, I didn't actually agree to this, so screw those rules. Those values don't apply to me. And they can really jeopardize the safety of students who do need that. And so some staff and some universities are better at relocating those students or kind of maintaining this community, but that requires that the sanctity of this floor is actually important to the university, and it has staff who are willing to advocate for that. And then, like I said, this kind of floor community rarely centers recovery as the shared value, but rather abstinence as the shared value or the shared purpose. And so those don't always line up for everybody. And so it's important to navigate that and know that for yourself. Okay, so then of course, this is the kind of the dream for a lot of collegiate recovery programs, which is dedicated university owned or residence hall on-campus housing that is kind of sponsored by the collegiate recovery community. Of course, as the dream, the pros are that it has dedicated staff support, a staff person that you pay full time that can spend a bunch of time with these students and kind of care for and with them. Hopefully these communities will be fully recovery supportive and recovery protective. Expectations in these communities are very clear. Typically, if staff are providing value sheets or folks are coming together at the beginning of the living experience to set expectations, and therefore they're easily enforceable. And then also staff and allies can implement very clear targeted programming where these students live, because they're kind of like, they live there. So why not bring a program to them so they can benefit from the other programs around the university. The cons of these, of course, is that you need to pay dedicated staff. The university has to be able to pay them. It's difficult to match the needs of students in recovery, especially when it comes to housing, especially when you have 8, 9, 10 students in recovery living together, going through that experience together. It's hard to match that with university policies, as I said before. For example, if a student has a recurrence of use, is your university one that will surround them with resources, care, and community? Or will it say, sorry, you broke the rules, here's a conduct sanction, you're out. And then that student is without housing. And so it's hard to find universities that are willing to be nimble and center the students and their recovery rather than center history and policies. So it's kind of a case-by-case struggle with these kind of houses. As I said before, it's hard in some universities with the residence life policies to support a diverse group of students all living together. When it comes to intergender housing, or for example, the average age of a student in recovery is I think like 26 or 27 the last time we did the full measurement. So was a university willing to invite, for example, a 32-year-old student to live with an 18-year-old student in the same floor or the same house, are they okay with that? Whether or not the students are. So it can be a barrier for sure. And then my final moment to rant, university-owned housing apartments or off-campus housing. So this is where folks start to really pull the resources. They use university resources, but are a little bit farther away from campus accountability. They can be a little bit more creative, but it can be a little bit tricky. the pros of having a apartment off campus that the university owns is that, first of all, that shows the university has some approval and buy-in for these students and their wellness. That can really show, it can bolster confidence and bolster a positive culture at the university. Typically also, if a university owns a property, it's close to campus, and so that convenience is really important. The two things that I think are critical when it comes to these kinds of models is that universities often are willing to fudge funding from other university budgets to allow this to happen. So for example, a university I was a part of, while the Collegiate Recovery Program was the front and center leader of the off/on-campus house/apartment, the university was willing to pay for the property, pay for the maintenance of the property, pay for the student staff who were going to live there, but still allow the Collegiate Recovery Program to run the space. And so that's great, because I mean, this is property that the university already owns. They need students to live there. Having a program on campus that wants to run it and wants to be accountable for it is a bonus for them. And so you can leverage that if, for example, there's a property that the university isn't sure what to do with, or there's a property coming up available, maybe a fraternity or sorority is no longer in that space, or different options come up there. Additionally, student financial aid can be a lot more accessible when a university owns a space, and students can kind of speak with the financial aid folks on their campus to utilize financial aid dollars to apply to these spaces. And it can be another added level of comfort and a little bit less stress. The cons, as I said before, is how much liability is the university willing to take with these spaces? Are they willing to actually give the reins and trust the staff who actually understand recovery, hopefully, to support these students? Are they willing to trust the students themselves? Again, universities weren't built with folks in recovery in mind, not even close. And so are they willing to listen to the students and the staff in these spaces in order to best support them? And then of course, if funding isn't directly available from the university, where does your funding come from? Last slide for me. This is more of me acknowledging that I'm not an expert in off-campus recovery housing and non-university owned recovery housing, but luckily we have Sazha and Amy here. But of course the options continue. Even if the university isn't super jazzed about the situation or their need to serve students in recovery because of stigma or whatever reason, luckily there are off-campus partners that we can work with to create spaces. One, of course, Oxford houses are a great alternative to on-campus university-owned housing. Some universities are really great with partnering with Oxford houses to give students a more seamless experience. The Haven at College, I encourage folks to look them up. Massive system of on-campus treatment, support, housing. Their list of services goes on and on. Alpha 180 is a well-marketed and well, I think, known example of what a off-campus college-centered men's housing experience can look like. That I think is a really good model that can be kind of structured out. And then, of course, Sazha's experience with Treehouse Learning Community that I'm sure we'll get to later. So, thanks. Amy, yeah? Nope, Sazha.
Oh, all right. Thanks, Dylan, and thank you for saying all that. At Treehouse Learning Community, it was definitely a pivotal moment in my recovery. We're going to start going into the solutions, and let's go ahead with Amy.
Thank you, guys. So I just want to preface my, my couple of slides. I just want to be very clear. I do not work for Oxford House. I don't represent them, and I don't promote them. I just simply get the privilege of sharing with all of you my lived experiences with Oxford House. So my first experience with Oxford House is that I got to live in one for the first 6 months of my recovery. Which was a great experience. It tethered me to a group of women who supported my newfound way of life. It provided accountability and a safe place for me to live, safe in the sense of removing certain people, places, and things and triggers that I would have faced if I had chosen to go back home. And I didn't always love it, but I was always grateful for the structure and support and being surrounded by people who were taking their recovery seriously and who could help teach me how to stay clean a day at a time. And I couldn't have imagined at the time the lasting impact that experience would have on my life years down the road. So we're going to go ahead and jump forward about 9 years. And so my next experience with Oxford House all started when I decided to pursue my MBA at UNC Greensboro. I immediately heard about the Spartan Recovery Program from a friend. Prior to that, I'd never heard of collegiate recovery. And, so prior to hearing about what the Spartan Recovery Program was, my plan was to attend class and go straight home, expecting to not be a part of the college experience and not spend a lot of time on campus. But to my surprise, being a part of the Spartan Recovery Program completely changed that. So in December of 2018, after my first semester, I got accepted to the SAFE Project's Leadership Academy and was told to come up with a project to complete that upcoming semester that could make an impact on collegiate recovery. So discussing this with then Spartan Recovery Program Coordinator Terry Spears, I learned that there were no ideal sober living options for students in recovery at UNC Greensboro. We discussed some of the pros and cons that Dylan just went over, and Terry had previously tried to get a collegiate Oxford House established, but always ran into certain challenges that prevented this dream from becoming a reality. So, I told her that I'd like to try again, and she was hopeful, but told me, not to get my hopes up too high, as it probably wouldn't work out based on her prior experience. So about a week later, I was at a completely non-related sponsorship family dinner party in Cary, and I'm sitting there telling my grand sponsor about this collegiate recovery project I was going to be a part of, and a lady sitting 2 seats down said, "Wait, are you talking about the SAFE Project Leadership Academy? They just asked me to be a mentor." So after I picked my jaw up off the table, I said, "Yes, and it just so happens I need a mentor." And so she said, "Well, here I am." And that was my introduction to Karen McKinnon. And so we both laughed, and she asked what my project idea was. And I mean, don't you know, we both about fell out when I told her that I wanted to start a collegiate Oxford House, and she responded that she just so happened to work for Oxford House. So that night we each emailed SAFE Project and, told them of our, what we both felt was a divine intervention meeting, and requested to be paired together. And it was official. Karen McKinnon was my mentor for this project. And so at that moment, I knew in my heart that despite the challenges I was expecting to face, that somehow it was just going to work out. I don't think that things like this just happen by chance. And that faith really kept me steadfast throughout the whole project, and hanging on to hope that, this was just bigger than me, and I just got to play a part in, kind of pushing it along and helping coordinate it. And I believed it was going to work out. I really did. So we jumped into planning, and in the quest of seeking the path of least resistance, I asked Carlos, who was the Oxford House outreach worker for the area, if we could just flip one of the existing houses surrounding campus to a collegiate house, but was told that wasn't an option. So then we immediately faced the main roadblock that Terry ran into in her efforts. Her previous efforts to try to get a collegiate Oxford House. There were already 6 Oxford houses surrounding campus, as you can see on the map here. And per zoning in Greensboro, you can't have a new Oxford House within a half mile of an existing house. So finding a new property, close enough to campus in that sweet spot was really difficult. So at one point in this process, Terry had talked to an owner of an existing Oxford House who had another rental property, and he was willing to apply for a new charter to make that an Oxford House as well. It was an ideal property. It was a 2-story duplex that we envisioned housing 6 men on one floor and 6 women on the other, and it was 0.7 miles from any other house per Google Maps. And just to remind you, 0.5 miles is that sweet spot that we were looking for. So we got very excited and hopeful, thinking like, this is it, this is perfect, because we were only looking to do one, and now, maybe we can get a men and a women's house started. But unfortunately, we found out that the half-mile radius is measured as the crow flies, not by Google Maps driving directions. And so, in fact, it fell within the half-mile zone and therefore was not a viable option. So this was, one of the many times where either Terry or Karen both kind of, would ask me, hey, do you have a plan B for this project? Do you want to maybe reconsider something else? But we continued to search for other properties to no avail. And so it was, at this point, it was about mid-March, and I had nothing to show for a project. So again, it was recommended, maybe it's time to go to Plan B. So I would actually have something to present at the summit at the end of at the Leadership Academy. But, so I reached back to the memory of that night at the dinner when Karen and I were, and I think we were divinely brought together. And I decided I wasn't ready to throw in the towel quite yet. So again, I asked the outreach worker, Carlos, if we could just flip one of the existing houses around campus. And he told me that since he'd already asked his boss that and gotten an answer, he wasn't comfortable asking again. But if I wanted to send a request, then that was my business. And if his boss, then brought it back to him to have a conversation, then he would back up the idea or support the idea, which I understood. And so with that, and I ran all this by Karen. So with her approval, I sent out a last-ditch effort email request pleading Oxford House to reconsider flipping one of the houses, since it was just a saturated market right around campus. So on March 26th, 2 days after I sent that email, we hadn't heard anything back yet. And Karen, for the last time, asked me if I was ready to, accept that this wasn't going to work out and go on to Plan B. And before I answered her, I reached out to Carlos, one more time. And he said that he was actually supposed to be talking to his boss the next day. So I told Karen, hey, just give me one more day. I'd really like to wait and see what this meeting, with Carlos and his boss turns up. So just one more day. And, 3 hours later, I actually got a call back from Carlos, and he told me that the conversation with his boss came early. And I'm going to go ahead and click. I'm sure, kind of obvious at this point, right? So they decided to flip a house, and finally, after weeks and weeks of being a little, fly in a lot of people's ears, we were going to get a collegiate Oxford house. So of course, I was just elated. Everybody involved was elated. Very exciting. But in between, so there were still more roadblocks to come, though, that came up between March 26th and May 21st, which is when I was notified that the lease had officially been signed and new furniture was ordered. So it was a waiting game, and I had to make a very concerted effort to stay in my lane. And there were times throughout this whole experience where my persistence, no doubt, got overwhelming. Is probably a nice word for it, for some of the people involved. But everyone extended grace, because we all have the same end goal at heart, to provide a safe, supportive, recovery-centered living environment for college students. So I organized one last meeting with the major parties involved, just to provide some clarity on how to ensure a supportive relationship moving forward, in which we understood our role in the collegiate recovery side in simply helping to fill the beds and provide that on-campus support without exerting, trying to influence or exert any type of governance, so that Oxford House is allowed to function as it's designed. You know, and I want to mention that there were so many people involved behind the scenes that made this whole project happen. Paula Harrington was a huge part of it. She's responsible for starting the very first collegiate Oxford houses at UNC Chapel Hill. Dean Blackburn, who is the director of wellness at UNC Chapel Hill. Will Madison was another Oxford House outreach worker who was brought in, and John Fox and Kathleen Gibson. All of these people, you know, among others, they did all the heavy lifting to coordinate with the landlord and all of the back end work that it took to make this a success. And the SAFE Project and APNC for sponsoring the Leadership Academy. I'm just so grateful to have had the opportunity to help play a small part in making this dream a reality. Really, really special time. So, you know, knowing that it would take time and is an ongoing effort to fill the beds with college students, we do consider the first year of the Spartan House to be a success. Currently, there are 4 young men living in the Spartan House, 3 of which are students who did exceedingly well this year. And I asked them, as well as some of the students from the UNC Chapel Hill houses, to share their experience in a survey and in a video interview. And what we consistently hear is that living in a collegiate Oxford house in conjunction with their own recovery program, along with the collegiate recovery community on campus, provided this really unique combination of recovery and academic support that helps students in recovery excel beyond their expectations. So I just wanted to wrap up by sharing some of their experiences with you all.
Like, hands down, it's been the biggest influence on my recovery over this past year. It's really, really hard to do things by yourself. No matter what you're trying to do, it's like super important to surround yourself with like-minded individuals, I've always thought. And so moving into this Oxford house and just being around people of the same age who are trying to do the same thing is so crucial, especially for somebody who's, you know, in an environment like college where drinking is very prevalent. It's very important to surround yourself with people who are also sober and trying to, like, you know, get good grades, studying, going to class, doing things that you're doing or you should be doing.
That was Owen from UNCG, and this is Aya from UNC Chapel Hill.
School is just a stressor for students in general, and like, you don't need to be in recovery in order to know that school is hard. So being in recovery, school is extra hard, and I think being around other students and having that collective, yeah, this is all hard and we're all doing this together and we're in recovery and we're still trying to be healthy, is probably a plus. It was definitely a plus.
So thank you guys so much for letting me share my experience with you. Next, we'll close with a brief overview of the future of recovery housing. And in March, just before the COVID stay-at-home order went into effect, I actually had the privilege to travel to East Carolina University to celebrate the grand opening of their collegiate Oxford house, and was also notified that UNC Wilmington also secured a collegiate Oxford house as well. So I'm excited. Keep a lookout for more collegiate houses, collegiate Oxford houses coming in the future. And if you have any questions about Oxford House, please contact Jason Giroux, whose contact information you can find in the follow-up slide. And now I'm going to pass it back to Sazha to wrap it up.
Thanks so much, Amy. I am so inspired by your story because it sounds like you stayed with it even though there were so many challenges, the challenges that even Dylan talked about. So to hear your lived experience and you kind of see also the fruits of that, just hearing those students, I also remember what it was like to be a student in early recovery. And again, I don't think I was able to do it without my collegiate recovery community, without having housing. So my heart's feeling very warm because of your story. So thanks, Amy. So we're going to go into the future of recovery housing. The future does look different today, especially with COVID-19 and all the other anti-racist movements going on in the world. So we don't know what it's actually going to look like. One effort that I know that we are doing in the world is we are building a nationwide recovery housing survey. And the National Recovery Housing Collective was built in 2019 under SAFE Project, and we are working with our partners all around the nation, from West Virginia, from New Jersey, from the Haven. The Haven's one of our partners, like Dylan said, Collegiate Recovery Housing and Treatment, MAT houses, Women with Children houses, independent sober living owners, Oxford House, also on the collective. We are working with Deloitte, who is helping to build a nationwide survey to locate recovery houses throughout the nation. So that's a big, arduous task, but no one has taken a crack at it yet. And unfortunately, it hasn't been done yet. So we are working really hard with this group, and I'm really proud of this group because they are volunteer and they show up every month to kind of go talk about things like, do we need the word abstinence in finding recovery houses? And we know that saying things like abstinence, you either need to define it or you need to be really inclusive to people. And what the most important piece of this is just helping people who need to find recovery housing quickly find it better than they have been, not just going on Google and looking for the closest recovery house. So also the future of recovery housing, we've done the COVID-19 pivot, and recovery houses are being directly impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. We have information on economic relief for recovery housing, because not only are the operators affected, the residents of the recovery house are also affected. We hold nationwide recovery housing conversations, and this is a way to just start engaging peers. A lot of times there just isn't enough support for recovery houses operators. I like to call it a labor of love. Some houses that are ethical, they don't make any money, and some houses that are ethical, they make a lot of money, and it really depends on the resident asking the right questions. So having these open conversations on how to look for them, how operators are dealing with stuff, really starts providing the transparency and the accountability, and changing the narrative of what recovery houses are and actually how helpful they are. And it's because there's like a microcosm of community and recovery in these recovery houses, and then they're connected with the larger recovery community. So much happens there, and many good recovery houses are around because of the community. So we also have a survey going out about how the economic issues with recovery houses is going on, and then also blogs too, if you guys are interested, on tips for the recovery housing community, a lot of different cleaning procedures, a lot of different visitation procedures. A lot of things have been changing, like in many spaces of the world. So next, we're just going to use these last few minutes to really start talking about the lived experiences, and have Dylan and Amy kind of really start talking about the questions that we missed that are important to talk about. So Dylan, please, if you could start the conversation.
Yeah, with you two, with lived experience in recovery houses, what are some of the quirks that someone new to this field or someone new to this section of recovery should know about?
So I'll jump in. You know, it's kind of just to echo though, like what's already been shared. You know, the difference between like the level of care that you're going to get in the house. Is it peer run? Is it, you know, staffed? Is it abstinence based? You know, those are all things. You know, I was lucky. I was pointed to an Oxford house by a treatment facility. You know, but had I not been given that guidance, I would have done exactly what Sazha said and just Googled. You know, actually, let's be real honest, I wouldn't have gone. I wouldn't have gone to, you know, sought out a recovery house because I didn't really want to go live in a recovery house anyways, but anyhow, yeah, so that's the navigating the different options can be very tricky.
Any thoughts for you, Sazha?
I think just asking the right questions, like what are the rules, and like what do you have to abide by? What we did at Treehouse Learning Community, and this is how I knew that I was going to feel comfortable there, is it was an open interview. I was interviewed by the residents there, and it was kind of like nerve-wracking, but they were also very sweet. They were sweet. They wanted to know about me. I wanted to know more about them, and especially working with communities, everyone kind of there has to be an openness to them. So I would definitely check the vibe of the house. I would ask how long they've been in operation for. I would ask, what do you do if somebody relapses or returns to use? I would ask them, do you have Narcan? I would ask them, what other services do they provide, or is this just peer run? Knowing what a person needs, especially in early recovery, can be helpful for this process. And also, if we're working with young people whose parents are paying, it's just as important for a parent to know, because I believe recovery is a self-directed process. So if you can direct yourself better, we can start asking the questions that are needed.
Yeah, knowing what questions to ask is so critically important, and like knowing what's actually important to you. May take some trial and error overall, but I guess next question to Amy first is, how would you advise someone to find the off-campus partner to help them create a collegiate recovery house?
So definitely just kind of taking a look at the recovery community as a whole. What's already available? Are there already existing recovery houses around the area? And then, if you're going to go as far as, looking into like starting, applying for a charter for an Oxford house, checking on the zoning requirements, and, just building relationships with local treatment facilities and recovery high schools as they're becoming more and more popular, and other collegiate recovery programs, because as it's been mentioned, a lot of times it's, demand, like trying to forecast demand is an issue. And then like I don't want to say turnover, but essentially that's what it boils down to, right? And so it's, it's important to be able to keep the house full and, sustainable. And again, like looking for different opportunities for funding. Are you seeking out, grants or donations from, local wealthier donors in the recovery community? I know they often give back a lot. So there's a lot of different angles that you can approach it.
Anything for you, Sazha?
I think also just kind of just echoing what Amy said, there's so many different pieces of the recovery community that are available, like treatment centers, like local meetings and different types of meetings. It's not just 12-step. There are so many other meetings, connecting with therapists, connecting with allies, just connecting with. You would be surprised who you could connect with. We know that addiction affects a lot of different people, and it's interesting to see what happens when you start showing up for support, just like Amy in her conversations. It just happens, and I don't want to say that things just happen. Things definitely take work, but I'm sure even Dylan, this, like connecting with buy-in or getting buy-in from the campus. It's the same kind of process, like getting buy-in internally, getting buy-in externally, and it is a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge conversation we have in any of our technical assistance stuff is like, do you know what actually exists before you start taking action? The recovery community can be a little sneaky. And by little, I mean very. And that, like, especially if you have a very stigmatized campus, a very stigmatizing campus, like, if you take the time to learn the community, you'd be surprised at what already exists or what you will find. Because we see a lot of folks be so eager to help that they actually duplicate in a problematic way things that are already maybe happening. So yeah.
I love that you say that, because one of our products at Safe Project is a community pulse survey, and it's free, and it's in our community playbook, and it just goes down the line of like the treatment centers, the police department, the local YMCA, the schools, like Amy said too, the recovery high schools if they're available. I would agree with you that you might just not, I wouldn't say sneaky, but you just might not know what's around the corner from your house.
Yep. Especially folks who are new to this movement, or maybe are a first-time collegiate recovery staff member, or moved across the country to take a collegiate recovery position. You may just not know the community just yet. So I'd say take the time and learn a little bit. Last question that we have written, and of course, if folks have more questions, we'll have the assessment at the end that you can ask questions and we'll respond after the fact. But what tensions exist in the recovery housing field around diversity and inclusion? Sazha, you mentioned a couple, but kind of naming those, and then how do you think we can do better moving forward?
Yeah, so I have been in this space for about 3 years now, and I would say that it is predominantly white and males. So that's made it hard to have a new, to just be new in the space, and to be young in the space, because there's a lot of turf wars, and there are people that are very they want to protect their work. And there are a lot of people doing a lot of work, but housing and homelessness has been an issue aside from recovery, and has so many racial disparities, and has affected Black and Brown communities for a very, very long time. I don't want to get into the issue of redlining, but especially with COVID-19, a lot of that is coming up right now. And if it's affecting people on a larger scale, think about how it's affecting Black and Brown communities on a smaller scale. And then like those in recovery, like the people that really need housing. So it's tough, and it's tough to find places that are culturally competent. I know they are around and they are available, and I'm happy to help anyone navigate through that. But it is challenging.
Yeah, we have a working group with our summer series group today, and our group was talking about kind of the partnerships that collegiate recovery programs will choose in the community. And I think it's important to recognize that, especially with collegiate recovery, if you think of the privilege involved in the conversation of who is able to access treatment, typically a lot of collegiate recovery students have been to treatment, who has most access to treatment, and then who has most access to recovery housing, and on top of that, who has the most access to universities, we accidentally hope create this system where we end up with, most recently, 93% of collegiate recovery students look like me, and they're white dudes. And so as we have collegiate recovery programs, we're looking to partner with recovery houses or treatment facilities, just being thoughtful of, are we unintentionally creating this cycle that simply furthers domination and oppression in recovery spaces? Again, especially if we realize that like housing is such a basic human need, but especially in collegiate recovery housing, we're pairing a basic human need with like folks who have the privilege to access higher education. And so like it's a kind of a weird balance that we have to take, of acknowledging the middle ground that is pretty deep that exists there. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And it's just like, for people with community colleges, like do they have housing? Do they have the access? And it goes very deep, and it's multi-layered and multifaceted. And thank you so much for saying that, Dylan. Any last comments, questions?
No.
Amy?
Nope. You guys did a fabulous job wrapping that up. I don't think there's anything else that I could add.
All right, cool. So now that we're down to our last few slides, our call to action for you guys, really helping the recovery housing space, is find out where your local recovery houses are. This could be a super easy process just by talking to someone connected with a local treatment center, Googling this, looking out for the National Recovery Housing Locator. And then, like we said plenty of times in this presentation, is start partnerships with community and campus housing options. Starting these partnerships now can be really helpful for the future. And then end the stigma through continued conversations on recovery housing. I don't know if I touched on this earlier, but NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is one of the issues with recovery housing. And because of the stigma of addiction, people do say they don't want these criminals, they don't want these addicts, and they don't want these junkies in our neighborhoods. And unfortunately today we're still dealing with that, and many recovery houses can't put their addresses on the internet because they are afraid of people coming and being stigmatized. So having those conversations on what it looks like, asking someone like, hey, what was your experience? What do you think could have been better? Or what was your favorite thing about that? Could just really help in the recovery housing space. And our last slide for you is just the follow-up. Amy said if you have questions about Oxford House, you can email jason.giroux@oxfordhouse.com. He is an amazing colleague of mine and also on the Recovery Housing Collective. And then you can click to join the Recovery Housing Facebook page to continue this conversation. And then finally, I would definitely love we would all love if you would scan this QR code for the assessment. It's really helpful if you need any more information. Dylan does great, is doing a collegiate recovery series right now on collegiate recovery communities. And he has even more information for you guys.
Awesome, thank you so much. Does anybody else want to add any final comments? No? Amy? No?
No,
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just wanted to remind everybody that it is going to be uploaded to YouTube. We're going to send out a link to all panelists and registrants. We ask that it's not shared with anyone without that are not registered for the conference. And thanks again so much for your time today.